Islamic dilemma? And is it really an unanswerable challenge for Muslims? What is the state of conversion and deconversion to Islam in the US and beyond? Our guest today, Dr. David Wood, is one of the most outspoken defenders of Christianity and critics of Islam. Given the death threats he has received, has it been worth it? These are a few of the questions we're going to discuss today. David, I saw you about a year ago when you flew out and we talked about the death of the apostles. Also, we had an interview that day with Rob Liefeld, which was super fun. But thanks for coming back on.
Yeah, that was cool meeting Rob Liefeld. I grew up reading his comics.
Yeah, that was one of my favorites of all time. Well, I know most of my audience is familiar with your work, but I would love to hear, maybe some don't know, kind of your journey to the Christian faith. What happened? And did you ever, by the way, consider becoming a Muslim?
I can answer the second one really easily, no. And that's
Okay.
because by the time I was sort of being invited to Islam, I'd already become a committed Christian. So, and then as the case was being presented to me, I was looking things up. Same as I did with Christianity. Eventually, I was looking at the main claims, and then going to the background and seeing what evidence there is for these claims. And you have lots of atheists who think it's the exact same situation. Like people just don't examine the reasons and don't investigate. And if you did, you'd find out there's no support for any of these things. That's absolute nonsense. If you start looking into the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, even if you have a commitment to naturalism and you don't believe it, you at least see why people would believe it, right? I mean, we have a ton of evidence that Jesus died by crucifixion. We have a ton of evidence that his closest followers were claiming that he was alive again later, and it appeared to them that they're willing to endure all kinds of things, as we discussed last year, including death. For their claim that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. So you start looking in there and you start looking into it, and it's like something actually happened there that convinced these guys what's going on. The claims of Islam are completely different. You look at their main arguments, and it would be things like the miraculous preservation of the Quran, dot for dot, letter for letter. You could look at any two Quran manuscripts in history and they match up perfectly, dot for dot, letter for letter. And so it's miraculous preservation. Well, you spend 5 minutes looking into that. It's complete nonsense. Whether you look at the manuscript tradition or different Qurans in the world today, or just their own sources about how the Quran was kind of compiled, it falls apart. The evidence shows the exact opposite of what the claim is, and so on with all their main arguments. And so Muslims started giving me tracts and stuff like that, and I would instantly just start going and looking things up and realize something's really weird is going on here with their arguments. As soon as you look into them, they fall apart. But that was actually in prison. I was in prison when I had my kind of first Muslim friend. We were weightlifting partners and so on, but ended up in prison for attacking my dad with a hammer. I was an atheist growing up, and for any atheists who are watching, no, I'm not saying atheists go around attacking people and so on. I wasn't just an atheist. I was eventually diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. So that's the disorder that psychopaths and sociopaths are the popular terms for people with antisocial personality disorder. But you're growing up and you don't know that you have a problem, right? No one sits you down and explains what antisocial personality disorder is. I'm starting to think people should, right? Like at some point, like in middle school, they should give a talk to students and say, okay, here are the symptoms of antisocial personality disorder. Here are the symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder. Here are the symptoms of histrionic personality disorder. So that if young people start seeing these symptoms in themselves or in someone around them as they're growing up, maybe they won't. Maybe they'll know what's going on and won't make some terrible decisions like I did, because I concluded that since I don't have normal emotional reactions that other people had, that I had evolved to a higher level of humanity where I was like beyond everyone else. Everyone else, they cry when people die and stuff. I don't. So it's like, you guys had these emotions for a while. You had these emotions and maybe they played some role and maybe they helped you somehow, but humanity 2.0's here, and we don't need that stuff anymore. And so I thought because I didn't have normal emotional reactions that I was somehow. I thought that I had some extra ability that other people lacked, whereas I eventually concluded that I lacked an ability that everyone else had, and so I was defective somehow. But anyway, so I didn't know that when I was growing up. I thought I was superior to everyone, and had this weird issue where anytime I was following any sort of rule that anyone gave me, it was like I'd been polluted or something. Like, so people raise me and tell me you can't do this, then as long as I'm obeying that rule, I felt like you had somehow polluted me. And the way to get out of that was to do the opposite of what I'm being told. And that just went on and on and on until I ended up in prison. First, they put me in a psychiatric hospital. That's where they diagnosed me with antisocial personality disorder. But you don't keep psychopaths and sociopaths in mental hospitals. You send them to prison. So I ended up in jail, and in jail I met a Christian named Randy who was in there for turning himself in for everything he'd ever done. I thought this was a pretty weird individual, but we started arguing, and this was the first Christian I met in my life who would actually like stand his ground day after day. The closest I got before then was like my parents didn't care a whole lot about things. So the only time someone would even like talk about Christianity at all would be my grandmother or my aunt. But my grandmother, one day, we were just standing in her kitchen. I was a kid, and she was just talking about her hand. And she goes, I mean, if you think about how amazing the hand is and how it's more complex than anything in this kitchen right now. It's, you can get the idea, that it was made. And so, but that was like the closest I'd ever gotten to like apologetics growing up, was something like that. But apart from little things like that, my experience was that Christians would start backing down as soon as you started arguing with them. And they would say, hey, come on, this isn't stuff you fight about. We don't want an argument. And anyway, was in jail and met a Christian who he'd been through it all. He'd been through it all. So he was arguing with me. And I thought at this time that I was the most advanced human being in the world. And here I was with a Christian, not just any Christian, a Christian who was dumb enough to turn himself in for everything he'd ever done. And so we just started discussing God and Christianity. And I was bothered by the fact that this Christian, who was an inferior being, was doing really well in these arguments, and then I didn't know what I was talking about and so on. So anyway, we got in this, as far as I know, world's first ever fasting battle. It wasn't a battle to him. He would just fast. He would say, hey, this is the first time in my life where I'm going to have the ability to fast for long periods of time because I'm locked up and, don't have to go to work or anything. So he went 7 days on nothing but water. And then just to beat him, just because I was enraged and I wanted to beat the Christian, I went 10. So I went, the first time I ever fasted, I never fasted in my life. First time I ever fasted, I went 10 days on nothing but water. And then, he'd fast and I'd fast and he'd fast. And whatever he did, I'd do a couple extra days. And he asked me eventually, he noticed, he said, how come every time I fast for a certain amount of time, you go like 2 or 3 days more? And it's like, I don't know, just coincidence. But eventually he went 40 days. So he went 32 days on water, and then he started drinking like Kool-Aid and stuff to prepare his body for food again, because you get messed up if you start eating again after you get messed up. And so he told me why he was doing 40 days and told me about Jesus fasting 40 days. And I said, all right, I'm going 42. And so I was on the 11th day when I passed out in front of a guard, and then they stuck me in a isolation cell. And back there, I decided I was going to study Christianity. I was going to study Christianity so that I would be able to destroy all this stuff. And we talked a little bit about this last year, that it was thinking about the deaths of the apostles and so on. I was just trying to think, because my theory before then was they had their guy, they had their Messiah, and he died, and they decided they wanted to keep the movement going. So they made up a story about him rising from the dead to keep the movement going. And it worked for them. Problem was, well, what happens when you start being persecuted and enduring, torture and death and so on? Why would you why would you do that if you know that you made it up? It's one thing if you hear a message and you believe it and you're willing to go out and die for it, but these guys were claiming they saw something. And I was just started to think, like who, out of anyone in history who made something up, made up a story, like who can I think of that willingly went to their deaths or endured persecution or whatever? Who's willing to do that for something they made up? And I was just thinking, no, you have to believe what you're enduring persecution and death for. And so my explanation stopped making sense. And when I started thinking, well, what does explain this? What explains this guy's public execution? And then all these followers saying they had seen him risen from the dead and appeared to them. And it was kind of that. And then I was thinking about a kind of a version of the design argument. And then I was thinking about a version of the moral argument. And at the end, it was just like, oh, okay, what have I got to lose? It's like this is looking like it may be true. I don't know that it's true. And there's all this information I don't know right now, but what if it is? What if it is? And I pray. What if I pray and then, it turns out not to be true? It's like, okay, I wasted a little bit of time. It's not like I'm getting any worse. I'm already, starving in a jail cell. So I kind of prayed with like, okay, let's see if anything changes here. And I prayed, and then everything did change really in really quick fashion. And so it's a cool time. It's a cool time for if you're a new Christian, because you have plenty of time to read the Bible and study the Bible and go to church services and Bible studies and so on. So I was doing that, and that's when I started meeting Muslims in prison and starting to talk to them and so on. And but no, they started inviting me to Islam, and I've been studying apologetics for a couple of years by that point, and so no, was never interested in converting after that.
Now, you and I first met, I think it was 2004, at the first EPS William Lane Craig conference that was hosted 20-some years ago. And Nabil was there as well. That was the first time I met him. Some people might know some of the story, but give us a little bit of the backstory of your relationship with him and the journey you saw him go through to become a Christian and leave Islam.
Well, it was kind of funny because I was looking, I'm just reading the Bible all these years. And what I would always think that Jesus sent them out 2 by 2. And I was always thinking like, hey, it'd be cool to have a partner in all this, right? like going out at 2 at a time or something like this. So anyway, I was thinking I had like a partner and stuff. And then Nabil and I both joined the speech and debate team at Old Dominion University. And we ended up going on you go to other universities for tournaments and stuff like that. And we ended up sharing a hotel room on that first trip. And so all I knew about him at this point was his name's Nabil. And so I'm thinking, okay, some kind of Muslim. His name's Nabil Qureshi. So some kind of Muslim, but you don't know if they're like liberal or, atheist, but from a Muslim background or something like that. So I had no clue like what kind of Muslim I'm talking to. But when we got to the hotel room and he started putting his stuff away, I saw him, he brought his prayer mat with him. And so it's just, okay, this is a Muslim who's at least serious enough to bring his prayer mat with him on a school trip. And so I'm sitting there reading the Bible in a year. So I was in Isaiah at that point, reading the Bible in a year. And I was thinking, okay, you may want me to talk to this guy, Lord, and I may be in this room for a reason, but if you want me to talk to him, could you let him start the conversation? Because if I start the conversation, people are going to say he's picking on the Muslim or he's attacking the Muslim or something like that. So let him start it. And it was shortly after that, he's putting his stuff away. I'm reading the Bible, and all of a sudden he goes, "So, are you a hardcore Christian?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And we got started on our conversations that weekend. And one of the nights we stayed up all night. We stayed up all night discussing these things. And I would just kind of, it wasn't like some intentional plan or strategy that I came up with, but it's kind of similar to Greg Koukl's tactics that I kind of just did this just by nature. If I'm talking to someone, I would just ask them questions about what they believe. And so I'm asking him, what do you believe about this? What do you believe about God? What do you believe about Jesus? What do you believe about Muhammad? What do you believe about the Quran? And so on, just asking questions, and then eventually start asking, like, what are your reasons for believing this stuff? Like, why do you believe this about Jesus? Why do you believe this about Muhammad? Why do you believe this about the Quran? And so he started giving me reasons, and he was just, Islam is proven by science and mathematics and history and logic, and everything points to Islam and the miraculous history of the Quran and so on. And so he just went on and on and on about all this evidence and these scientific miracles, which I hadn't looked into this stuff at this point. But he's telling me all these arguments. And so he kind of like completed his case. And then I said, all right, I got one more question for you. If you're wrong, do you want to know it? And he's like, well, I'm not wrong. I said, I didn't say you're wrong. I said, if you were wrong, would you want to know it? Or would you want to go on believing in something that is not true? Which one? And he actually paused and thought for a while. And he said, yes and no. He said, yes, I would want to know the truth about God. He said, but no, because I know it would destroy my family.
Oh,
and
goodness.
That was kind of Nabil in a nutshell. He had his loyalty to God, but he really loved his family, and did not, under any circumstances, want to hurt them. But anyway, I ran with that. I ran with him wanting to know the truth about God. So we had our first discussions that weekend, and that continued for about 4 years. And then he became a Christian, and I thought, cool, I'm done with Islam. And didn't work out that way. It was about a month later. He got his first death threat, and it was attached to his car. So that's actually serious. But it was about a month later, he got his first death threat. It was attached to his car. And I was just thinking, I can't let him face this by himself. So, I mean, if you're coming for him, you got to come for both of us. So anyway, and so that's why I continued for a little while. And then over time, I realized, wow, Muslims make really awesome Christians. And there's a reason for that. It costs them a lot. Conversion costs them a lot. I converted to Christianity in a jail cell. As far as most of my family was concerned, it wouldn't have mattered if I became a Buddhist or anything else, as long as it was, making me somehow better and not commit crimes. But so there wasn't a lot of concern about choosing the wrong path or something like that. It's just, are you going to start behaving better? But in Islam, it's a pretty big issue. They're told all their lives that the worst possible sin you can commit is shirk, which is if you say Jesus is Lord, you've committed the worst possible sin in Islam. That's a one-way ticket to hell. And on top of that, they know that either they're going to have to, either their families will abandon them and not talk to them anymore, or at the very least, the relationship is going to be very strained for a very long time. And on top of that, there is the death penalty for apostasy in Islam. Muhammad said, if anyone leaves his Islamic religion, kill him. And doesn't get carried out a lot in the West, but you always have to start wondering, all right, is someone eventually going to carry out this penalty? And so, that's all like massive psychological pressure on Muslims. But the positive side is that when someone like Nabil says, I've been told all my life this is the worst possible sin, and I don't know how my family's going to react, but if they turn their backs on me, then they turn their backs on me, and this may get me killed, but you know what? I want to know Jesus. That's someone who will stand up for Jesus. So
that makes total sense. Now, I want to get into a little bit of your ministry and the focus of it, and then make sure we get to this Islamic dilemma, because I remember a year ago you telling me, you're like, Sean, you got to talk about this on your channel. It's really important. But my father, he's 86 years old right now and is not doing debates, not writing anymore. He's not able to. But as you know, in the early 80s, debated Ahmed Deedat, just huge debate in its time. But my dad had a philosophy where he wouldn't critique Islam or other systems. He would give the positive for his position. And you've obviously taken a different approach, and this is not better, worse. It's more just tell me what approach you've taken and why.
Well, I spend a lot of time blasting away at Islam and the claims that basically Muslims have heard their entire lives. And as far as like the approach I've taken, that had a lot to do with Nabeel. I mentioned that we were having these discussions for about 4 years, but for the first, I'd say 2.5 years, we were almost exclusively discussing Christian topics. Did Jesus die on the cross? Did he rise from the dead? Is he the Son of God? Are the New Testament books reliable, historically reliable, and so on? So we were focused on those kinds of questions. And eventually we started applying the same level of scrutiny to Muslim claims about the Quran and Muhammad. And Nabeel told me after he became a Christian, and this is kind of the relevance here. After he became a Christian, he told me, he said, whenever we would examine the evidence for some Christian topic, he said, even though I was arguing against it the entire time, I was thinking to myself, wow, Christians actually have good evidence for what they believe. So he'd be thinking, okay, I don't believe Jesus died on the cross, but they have really good solid evidence that Jesus died on the cross. And it was the same for the resurrection, for Jesus' divine nature, and for the reliability of the New Testament. Nabeel said he kept thinking, they actually have evidence for this. I didn't think there was going to be evidence for this, but they actually have good evidence for this. But he said what happened in his mind was that when he would think, okay, they really have good evidence for what they believe here, he would also think to himself, well, even if they can show me with 99% certainty that all these things are true, I'm still 100% sure that Islam is true because of the scientific miracles and because of the miraculous preservation of the Quran. And so it's like when a Muslim is thinking like that, you're kind of fighting a losing battle in a sense. You know, there can be something miraculous that happens, but as far as your arguments are concerned, if someone is 100% convinced that Islam is supported by all this evidence because they've been told that all their lives, it's very difficult for them to take anything else seriously. Like, how do they take anything else seriously at that point when they've got 100% certainty? And that's why it was important for us to look at these claims for miraculous preservation of the Quran and, you know, going through these supposed scientific miracles and so on. And what this would look like is Nabeel would quote a hadith or a passage from the Quran and say, this is knowledge that couldn't have possibly been known at this time. It's miraculous and so on. And I would, I started buying their sources, and I would go to the passage, and I would always say, I want to read that for myself. Not what you're telling me it says. I want to read what it says for myself. So I started buying the sources, and I'd go through there and I'd be thinking, well, that's not what it says. That's not what it says. And someone's just taking a little part of what it says and ignoring the rest of what it says. And the rest of what it says is clearly wrong. And then, oh my goodness, look at the next passage. That is definitely wrong. And started going back to him. So he'd say, matter of fact, there was Mike Licona. Mike Licona lived in the same area we did. And he had a regular apologetics study where we'd have atheists, we'd sometimes have Muslims, and we sat there and we went through an entire presentation with Nabeel. Nabeel gave an entire presentation on scientific miracles in the Muslim sources, and I was not familiar with this stuff, so I'm just sitting there taking notes, and then I go look up everything, and then I start sending him messages and emails. I still got the emails. I want to go through these sometimes. It's actually funny.
Yeah.
But Nabeel was incredibly intelligent. So I'm sitting there going, how are you not getting this? How are you taking this as a miracle? Look at the next passage. You know this is wrong. You know this is false. You're starting medical school. You know this is wrong. And it took a while, but the end of all that was he started realizing that once you start looking into these arguments, they'd been exaggerated. The evidence for Islam, at the very least, had been exaggerated. And so it was kind of once his confidence in Islam was shaken that he's able to take Christianity a little more seriously. And then he got to the point where he's asking God for like dreams and visions and stuff like that to tell him, because he's like, I don't know what to believe here. But him getting to the point where he was that open had a lot to do with him seeing that the things he'd been taught about Islam just weren't true. And that's pretty much my experience with Islam since then, because back then it was just my experience with Nabeel. But most Muslims I've seen who left Islam and became Christians, they only took Christianity seriously after they saw some problems with what they've been taught about Islam. They started seeing problems with Muhammad and so on. In fact, there was a poll several years ago by a Muslim who asked Muslims. He said, "I'm only talking to those of you who doubt sometimes, who doubt your religion sometimes. When you doubt your religion, what is it that's causing those doubts?" The number one answer was moral problems with Muhammad. Like, why are we taking this guy seriously when there's all these problems? Great presentations of an alternative to Islam, that was very low. That was very low. That was not something that would ordinarily cause Muslims to doubt that Islam is true. So it was problems in their religion that would cause them to doubt the claims of Islam, and then they're able to take an alternative more seriously. But with all that said, it's good to have like a variety of approaches. So there are tons of us now who are going out there, kind of exposing the claims of Islam, who are pointing out problems with Muhammad and so on. There are other Christians who are, preaching the gospel and defending Christianity, and there's some who do both, and there's some who pick one or the other. But it's a big world, and there are all kinds of different kinds of Muslims out there. So it's all welcome as far as I'm concerned.
Makes total sense. Now, one more question before we get to the Islamic dilemma. You said for Muslims who doubt their faith, it's more the moral challenges than it is, say, historical challenges, Surah 4, that Jesus didn't die by crucifixion, or contradictions in the Quran. What are some of the leading moral issues with Muhammad in particular that really give many Muslims pause when they hear it?
Well, and this was the case with Nabil, but they're told all their lives that Muhammad's the best human being who's ever lived. And I mean, I've got Muslim apologetics books, Dawah books, and so on that are just filled. I mean, it's just page after page after page about how his character was so perfect, how he is so massively superior to every other human being who's ever lived, including other prophets and so on. And you just read this all your life, and it gets built into their brain, like, how could this guy have been a liar or not have been a prophet or been just misled or been insane or something? It's kind of like their version of the trilemma, but it's based on the idea that his character is so perfect. How could he be wrong or be lying or something like that if his character is so amazing and perfect? And so it just makes sense that he's telling the truth if his character is perfect in every other way. And all of a sudden they find out, wait a minute, I wasn't told about this, and that. But some of the things that tend to bother Muslims, that the number one thing is that he married a 6-year-old girl named Aisha, and that he consummated the marriage when she was 9 years old and he was 54. So he was 54 years old, and he had sex with a 9-year-old girl who, according to their sources, was prepubescent. And lots of Muslims know that now. If you go back 20 years, most Muslims didn't know that at all. They found that out because we started sharing that information. And, so they'll give explanations for why it was actually good or Muhammad really needed to do that for some reason. But for lots of Muslims, it starts bothering them. Like, wait a minute, this is a guy I'm told is, his character is perfect. And he's the one that Allah says in the Quran, in Surah 33, verse 21, that this is the pattern of conduct for Muslims. So the pattern of conduct is a guy who, when he's 54 years old, had sex with a prepubescent 9-year-old girl. And that just starts bothering them. And it just kind of goes on from there. They're told, Muslims in the West especially were told that Muhammad came along and he freed all the slaves and so on. It's like, that's complete nonsense. It's complete nonsense according to the sources. Muhammad, according to their sources, bought, owned, sold, and traded Black African slaves. So they'll hear something all their life and they'll think, wow, what a great man. And then they find out the opposite is true. You have stories of there's the Battle of Khaybar, where they Muslims sort of went and attacked a Jewish settlement. And there was a man named Kanana who knew where some money was hidden, but he wouldn't tell. And so Muhammad had one of his followers light a fire on the guy's chest to torture him. And so they tortured him and then chopped his head off. But then Muhammad took the guy's wife back to his tent. So they just tortured and killed this woman's husband. Muhammad takes her back to his tent, and one of his soldiers stood guard all night around the tent in case she tried to kill Muhammad. So anyway, you have things like